Gracious God, we beg you to still the storm to a whisper and quiet the waves of the sea. And we will be glad because of the calm and the harbor that we are bound for. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Our readings this morning, not only from Job, but also from the Psalm and from the Gospel of Mark, take us into the middle of a storm. God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind and weather and natural occurrences like the storms forming in the Gulf right now can cause whirlwinds. The chaos of wind and rain and floods that can disrupt power and water, destroy homes, roads, streets, and bridges, and make us feel lost and vulnerable. Whirlwinds can also come in human conflict, whether on a personal or global scale. We can feel lost and alone and vulnerable in our own families as a result of illness, whether it's psychological, emotional, or physical, death, addiction, divorce, change in relationships. They can undermine our sense of security and make us feel alone. We can lose our way as a human family and stop noticing. It's when we get used to things, right? We get used to things and we stop noticing and stop trying to fix our own self-focus, our apathy, and maybe even carelessness about systems of oppression, whether it's against people or nations or even the earth itself. Any kind of change can feel like an overwhelming whirlwind in our lives, causing us to feel lost and fearful. And that's even when we're changing things for the good. For example, as we moved out of the pandemic and we're trying to come back to normal, as you've all seen, we have put the hymnals back in the pews, we've got the books of common prayer back in the pews, we've tried to shorten the bulletin, and we're used to putting everything in so we can all read it. So many details. Did we get enough hymnals back? I don't know. Are the prayer books back? Did we get the page numbers right on the hymn boards? I think Bobby changed those. Oh my goodness. And here, this one gets my attention. Do I even remember how to chant after 18 months of not singing? In these moments of disorientation, we've forgotten who we are and whose we are and how we want to be and interact in the world. We've lost our way. Especially when our life or way of life is threatened, we can wonder where God is. So how do we find our way when we're lost and off track? Well, first, we remember that God is not the storm. God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind. In the Psalm, God quiets the storm, stills it to a whisper. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus calms the storm. God tells Job that he's got it all under control. He measured the earth, he fitted it with clouds as clothing, he knows where the bounds of the sea are, he's got it handled. And by the way, Job wasn't even a little bit involved in any of that. And Jesus is not with the storm on the Sea of Galilee either. During my time in the Holy Lands, I had the opportunity of going out on the Sea of Galilee, really probably about every 2 weeks or so. And we went out in wooden-keeled, ribbed boats, much like the fishing boats used in Jesus' time. How do we know that? That's a great question, right? Della, how on earth do we know that? We know that because about under a decade ago, 5 to 7 years ago, a Jesus boat was found buried in the mud as the Sea of Galilee lowered and there was a bit of a drought and the waters went down. We found the first century fishing boat that was largely intact. Its keel was intact, its ribs are still up on the side. And that boat is now on display in very carefully controlled environmental circumstances because it is preserved by in a museum near Capernaum. So yes, we have seen those things, and these boats, that went out on the lake, which is a freshwater lake about 60 miles in circumference, about like Lake Burton, I think they call them. And so that would be the funny thing about that. It's like small lakes and hills. The wind comes up. It does come up. It comes up suddenly. The waves crash against the boat. The sky darkens, and the boat rocks. And so we can imagine, we signal the captain to turn off the motor and head upwind, so we could all experience together the rock of the boat and that sense of peril as we read the story from Mark's Gospel about Jesus calming the storm. And where was Jesus in all this? He was asleep, and this is an important detail. He was asleep in the stern, falling asleep on a cushion. And I can imagine that too, because after a long day of pilgrimage, when the sun was coming down and glinting on the water in the afternoon, you know how it does when it sparkles, and the gulls are swirling overhead. It's just an amazing feeling. Of course, Jesus was asleep. Jesus, after the storm comes up, he doesn't summon the storm. He doesn't even react to the storm. It's the disciples who panic, sure that Jesus has abandoned them. They wake him up saying, "Teacher, do you not even care that we are perishing?" Jesus is in the stern of the boat the whole time, right by the tiller, right? Comes the storm, and all is smooths down. Why do we feel that God has abandoned us when we are in fear and in pain, in peril, confused and lost our way? Jesuit priest James Martin says maybe it's because when we're struggling, we tend to focus on the area of pain. And that distracts us from our ability to see where God might be at work in other places. Homiletics professor J.M. Schnell-Ribbentrop tells us that we need to have the habits and practices in place to bring us into predictable awareness of the divine. We need to have tools that pull us out of the storm of information, disaster, and grief, that storm that is not God, so that we can breathe in the Spirit. When we're caught up in turmoil, saddened by more loss than we think we can bear, face conflict in our families or communities, or are just plain headed in the wrong direction, the tool to grab is prayer. Prayer connects us with God, reminds us of what we believe, and it reminds us of who we want to be with others. Prayer doesn't change God. Prayer changes us. As Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby says, prayer is not about sending requests into the sky. Prayer is about allowing God to make us more like Jesus Christ. And also, prayer is not only about words. It's about praying with your hands, praying with your feet, and being Jesus' hands and feet on earth. As Pope Francis tells us, you pray for the hungry, then you feed them. This is how prayer works. How do we learn to pray? Archbishop Justin tells us we do it by praying, and our prayers shape our belief. We become our prayers. We repeat and we repeat our prayers, reminding ourselves of the way of Jesus that we've chosen and the path before us becomes